Good afternoon. This is Pamela, and you're listening to Watchman on the Pod. I am going to read out of Matthew Henry's commentary about the book of Daniel, chapter 5. Belshazzar now returned in Babylon. Some compute he had reigned 17 years, others about 3. About 2 years before this, Cyrus, king of Persia, a growing monarch, came against Babylon with a great army. Belshazzar met him, fought him, and was routed by him in a pitched battle. He and his scattered forces retired into the city, where Cyrus besieged them. They were very secure because the river Euphrates was their bulwark, and they had 20 years' provision in the city. But in the second year of the siege, he took it. 1. The riotous, idolatrous, sacrilegious feast which Belshazzar made, verses 1 through 4. Number 2, the alarm given him by a handwriting on the wall, which none of his wise men could read, verses 5 through 9. Number 3, the interpretation of the mystical characters by Daniel, who dealt plainly with him and showed him his doom, written, verses 10 through 28. And number 4, the immediate accomplishment of the interpretation in the slaying of the king and the seizing of the kingdom, verses 30 and 31. So 1 through 9. Belshazzar, the king, very gay, but all of a sudden very gloomy. He affronts God, and God affrightens him. 1. He made a feast or banquet of wine. Probably it was some anniversary. Historians say that Cyrus, who was now besieging Babylon, knew of this feast, and presuming that they then would be off their guard, buried in sleep and wine, took the opportunity to attack the city, and so made himself master of it. Belshazzar invited 1,000 of his lords to come and drink with him. In this sumptuous feast, 1, he bade defiance to God's judgments. His city was now besieged. His life and kingdom lay at stake. He should therefore have proclaimed a fast, but as one resolved to walk contrary to God, he proclaims a feast. Number 2, he put an affront upon the temple of God. Verse 2, while he tasted the wine, he commanded to bring the vessels of the temple that they might drink in them. 3, he put an affront upon God himself and bade defiance to his deity. For they drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver. Verse 4. Number 2, how God affrighted the king and struck a terror upon him. Belshazzar and his lords are in the midst of their revels. But the hour had come that must be fulfilled, which had been long ago said of the king of Babylon, Isaiah 21, 2 through 4. The night of my pleasures has he turned into fear to me. Number 1, there appear the fingers of a man's hand writing on the plaster of the wall before the king's face. Verse 5. Here was no destroying angel with his sword drawn, only a pen in the hand, writing upon the wall over against the candlestick, where they might all see it by the light of their own candle. The king saw the part of the hand that wrote, but saw not the person whose hand it was. What we see of God, the part of the hand that writes in the book of the Scriptures, may serve to possess us was with awful thoughts concerning that of God, which we do not see. If this is the finger of God, what is the arm? What is his arm made bare? 2. The king is immediately seized with a panic. Verse 6. His countenance was changed, his color went and came, the joints of his loins were loosed, his knees smote one against another. Why is he in such a fright? His thoughts troubled him. His own guilty conscience told him that he had no reason to expect any good news from heaven. God can soon make the heart of the stoutest sinner to tremble, and there needs no more than to let loose his own thoughts upon him. Number 3, the wise men of Babylon are called in to see what they can make of this writing upon the wall. Verse 7. Whoever will read the mind of God in the scriptures, the king promised that whoever would give him a satisfactory account of this writing should be dignified with the highest honors. Number 4. The king is as disappointed. They can none of them read the writing, much less interpret it. Verse 8, which increases the king's confusion. Verse 9. Now, verses 10 through 29. 1. The information given to the king by the queen mother concerning Daniel, how fit he was to be consulted in this difficult case. It is supposed that this queen was the widow of evil Merodach, that famous Nitocris, whom Herodias mentions as a woman of extraordinary prudence. Tidings being brought to her apartment, she came herself to the banqueting house to recommend to the king a physician for his melancholy. She could not read the writing herself, but directed him to one that could. Let Daniel be called now, who should have been called first. He is a man in whom is the spirit of the holy gods, who has something in him more than human. She speaks honorably of him as a man that had light and understanding and wisdom. It was evident he was divinely inspired. He had knowledge and understanding beyond all the other wise men for interpreting dreams. He had an admirably good heart. An excellent spirit was found in him. The king, thy father, that is thy grandfather, made him master of the magicians. He named him Belteshazzar, according to the name of his God, thinking thereby to put honor upon him. Let Daniel be called, and will show the interpretation. Number 2, Daniel was brought in before the king. Verse 13. The king says with an air of haughtiness, Art thou that Daniel who art of the children of the captivity? He acknowledges that all the wise men of Babylon were baffled. They could not read this writing, nor show the interpretation. Verse 16. But he promises him the same rewards that he had promised them if he would do it. Verse 16. Number 3, the interpretation which Daniel gave of these mystic characters was far from easing the king of his fears. Daniel was now in years, and Belshazzar was young, and therefore he seemed to take a greater liberty of dealing plainly and roundly with him than he had done upon the like occasions with Nebuchadnezzar. 1. He undertakes to read the writing which gave them this alarm, and to show them the interpretation of it. Verse 17. He slights the offer of rewards, for he is not one of those that divine for money. Let thy gifts be to thyself, for they will not be long thine, and give thee to another. Let us do our duty in the world, read God's writing, and make known the interpretation of it. Number 2, he recounts to the king God's dealings with his father Nebuchadnezzar, verse 18 and 21. He describes the great dignity and power to which the divine providence had advanced Nebuchadnezzar, verse 18 and 19. His ability was so strong that it was irresistible. His authority was so absolute that it was uncontrollable. Whom he would he slew, whom he would he saved alive, though both were equally innocent or equally guilty. Whom he would he set up, and whom he would he put down. He sets before him the sins which Nebuchadnezzar had been guilty of, whereby he had provoked God against him. The description given of his power intimidates his abuse of his power. He behaved insolently towards the God above him, and grew proud and haughty. Verse 20. He reminds him of the judgments of God that were brought upon him for his pride and obstinacy, how he was deprived of his reason, and so disposed from his kingly throne. Verse 20. Driven from among men to dwell with the wild asses. Number 3, in God's name he exhibits articles of impeachment against Belshazzar. Before he reads him his doom from the handwriting on the wall, he shows him his crime. He had taken warning by the judgments of God upon his father. Verse 22. Though his son, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thy heart, though thou knewest all this. He had affronted God more impudently than Nebuchadnezzar himself had done. Witness the reveals of this very night. Verse 23. Thou hast lifted up thyself against the Lord of heaven. Thou hast profaned the vessels of his house, and made the utensils of his sanctuary instruments of thine iniquity, and hast praised the gods of silver and gold, which see not, nor hear, nor know anything, as if they were to be preferred above the God that sees and hears and knows everything. He had not answered the end of of his creation and maintenance. The God in whose hand thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways, hast thou not glorified. This is a general charge which stands good against us all. Our dependence upon God as our creator, preserver, benefactor, owner, and ruler, not only from his hand or our breath was at first, but in his hand our breath is still. It is he that holds our souls in life, and if he take away our breath, we die. We ought to glorify him, to devote ourselves to his honor, and employ ourselves in his service. We have all sinned and have come short of the glory of God. This is the indictment against Belshazzar. Number 4, he now proceeds to read the sentence as he found it written upon the wall. Then, says Daniel, when thou hast come to such a height of impiety as thus to trample upon the most sacred things, then when thou wast in the midst of thy sacrilegious, idolatrous feast, then was the part of the hand, the writing fingers, sent from him, from God. He sent them, and this writing thou now seest was written. Verse 24. Now the writing was Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. Verse 25. The significance of them is he has numbered, he has weighed, and they divide. Number 1, many, repeated for the thing is certain. Mene, mene. That signifies both in Hebrew and Chaldean. He has numbered and finished, which Daniel explains thus, verse 26. God has numbered thy kingdom. Here is an end of thy kingdom. Number 2, Tekel, signifies in Chaldean, thou art weighed, and in Hebrew, thou art too light. God does not give judgment against him till he has first pondered his actions and considered the merits of his case. Number 3, Upharsin, verse 28. Thy kingdom is divided, is rent from thee and given to the Medes and Persians, as a prey to be divided among them. Belshazzar was so far convicted by his own conscience of the reasonableness of all he said that he gave Daniel the reward he promised him, and put on him the scarlet gown and the gold chain, and proclaimed him the third ruler in the kingdom. Verse 29. Verses 30 through 31. 1. The death of the king. Heathen writers speak of Cyrus's taking Babylon by surprise with the assistance of 2 deserters that showed him the best way into the city. Number 2, the transferring of the kingdom into other hands. From the head of gold we now descend to the breast and arms of silver. Darius the Mede took the kingdom in partnership with and by the consent of Cyrus, who had conquered it. Verse 31. So that right there is the commentary from Matthew Henry on the book of Daniel, chapter 5. A lot to take in. All right, brothers and sisters, I love you so very much. Keep your eyes on Jesus. Always, always, always. Your nose in the book, which is the Word of God. And embed the Word of God upon the tablets of your hearts, so you will not sin against God or be deceived. I'll start reading chapter 5 here in chapter 6, here in a few minutes. I love you all. Bye-bye.